There was that exhibit of Schames works in the 80s in Frankfurt. So this may be from all the way back to...
Could be 30 years old.
30 years old, yeah. I knew both Samson and Edith very well. Samson was a good friend of my father's.
Samson Schames was born in Frankfurt and grew up in a very old Orthodox Frankfurt family whose roots are going back to the Frankfurt Judengasse. This means up to the 18th century.
Schames comes from a very interesting family. First of all, he has a religious background, an Orthodox religious background. His family was part of the Israelitische Religionsgesellschaft, and you can see in his works that he's really familiar with Jewish tradition. So what you can see, I think, in his early works, and especially in the mosaics, is that he didn't study, let's say, pure fine art in the beginning, but it was more applied arts. So he was doing art, he was doing scenes for the theater as a stage designer as well. And you can see this rather cynic approach to art in his early works and in the mosaics as well.
Samson was forced to flee as a result of the Nazis taking over. And he barely made it out in time, he and his wife.
I think one of the major aspects of his having used detritus and found materials, of course, had something to do with his situation, not only as a refugee, but primarily as someone who was interned in a camp. When he was interned, he made his own art materials, his own paints made out of soot and condensed milk, and as a brush he would use some of his own hair. And the material he uses is urban detritus, really, basically. He used the, if you will, the roughness of the material to express his inner world.
And the insistence on creating from the detritus of the Blitz, all the pieces of glass and cement and wire caused by the bombing during the Blitz, and he insisted on continuing to use even that as evidence of the continuation and the persistence of the human spirit.
I think Schames was motivated, of course, by the need to use art material, and that's what he found. He found broken material, broken objects, odds and ends. The very idea of using shards to express a broken world, I think, is just very novel.
There was no paint available, there was no canvas available, none of the materials that a painter would normally use, none of those materials were available. But the necessity to create from the rubble of the Blitz was what inspired him and what drove him to create these works.
The subjects of these are very sad, gruesome: execution, sacrifice, unknown victim, return to the fatherland, where there are three figures who are obviously the walking wounded or the walking missing legs. It's very moving and very sad.
It's very obvious that Schames was very much overcome by the grief of his war experience.
I don't think they were meant as self-portraits. They were cries of anger, cries of grief as he suffered through the Blitz and as he had watched what happened to the country in which he had grown up and which chased him and eventually killed his sister and his mother.
The subsequent generations after the war, and when I think about this, I think about actually the third generation and the upcoming fourth, are getting further and further from the tactile relationship to this period. And when you see an artist like Schames, who worked in the materials of war and worked through the trauma of war in his varying mediums, it's a way of accessing the insanity of the period, the devastation of the period, and really it screams. A lot of it screams at you. I mean, especially when you're looking at the material used from Blitz bombings being, created into visceral figures.
The ones he did after the war in the 50s in New York were done for an exhibition called Contemporary Art in Synagogues and Homes, and were relating closely to Jewish religion. Two of these works are still in the Jüdisches Museum in Frankfurt and are relating, one to Hanukkah with kindling the lights, and the other to Rosh Hashanah with the title Blowing the Shofar. These works Schames did with glass that he broke and put afterward together to form these reliefs, and are more related to religion than to the destruction of the World War II. These mosaics are reflecting his attempt of expressing his feelings he had after the war about Jewish tradition and his life. And so they are still connected very close to what happened in the 40s and expressing this fragmented life after war.
Since Schames is a Frankfurt artist who was forced to exile, it's been important for the museum to collect his works and make him more known, because this is part of the faith of him and other artists as well that were forced into exile, that they get less known in Germany today. So by collecting him, we tried to make him more known in Germany again.
Schames' work is relevant today because he's really one of the forerunners of detritus art. But trying to make something out of nothing is certainly an idea today, and I think he is a bit of a forerunner. We should really try to remember who came before us. He came of age artistically in the 20s and 30s, and then he had to go, and then he had to leave. And many artists really had to give up their profession even. And he was able to sustain his artwork and his creative practice.
What I recognize in his art is tremendous vibrancy, a will to live, an imagination, and an insistence on keeping going.
We would love to see those mosaics exhibited, and they would be a very interesting example for people in Germany, in the UK, or in the United States. And it would be both a reminder of the utter destruction of World War II, but more so from the Leo Baeck perspective, an example of what it's like for someone to have to leave their country and continue their art. And so there's this perfect melding of the migrant experience, the destruction of the Blitz, and creative art. And the themes themselves of the mosaics are of value. And so people would be looking at these and not just saying, oh, look, there's a nail there, or look at that piece of glass, but look at the story that Schames constructed in the mosaics. So I think it would be a very exciting combination of art and history.